got the eager evangelist who creates miracles with eggs. So some stories we know and some we don't know. But this is the time of year when winter melts into spring. And in our pagan religions, we honor the rising of the sun, S-U-N, and the return of the sun. And in our Christian stories, we hear the rising and the return of the sun, S-O-N. And we get to see how very similar we all are, because underneath all these symbols is just the return of the light. We're all super excited about the return of the light. So we know about the stories, the fertile stories of the Easter Bunny. Hugh Hefner continues to use that symbol to tell us about the Easter Bunny. It's about fertility, and that's the spring. And all of its ways she bursts forth in all these amazing and ecstatic ways. And then we know about the crucifixion, we know about Jesus. You know? But we don't always know about this eager evangelist who carries eggs. And that's Mary Magdalene. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Mary Magdalene isn't always known as a preacher or a gospeler. But she's the first person who actually preaches the gospel of Christ as risen. She's the first one to see him risen. And risen from the illusion of death. And she's called the Apostle of the Apostles. And her history is completely polluted with the proclamation of prostitute, right? You know, like that's what we know about her, that she's a prostitute. And it's interesting that we, use these ways to shame the truth into submission. And yet, still it rises. So, one day Jesus was assassinated and hung on the cross, but the feminine divine has been assassinated, for eons. And so these are the things that we rise from. We get to rise from. Let's look at the scraps that we have of from the Bible. So it says in John 20, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. She saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Peter, Simon, and the other disciples, the one that Jesus loved. And she said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where he is. So Peter and the other disciple, he goes nameless in this piece of the Bible. It's just the other that Jesus loved. This other dude, who turned out to be a fast runner in this story. They reach the tomb, so the fast guy reaches the tomb before Peter, and he stands outside and he just peeks in. He bends over and he sees the strips of linen that are still laying there. And then Simon comes along behind him and went right into the tomb, and he sees the strips of linen as well as the cloth that was wrapped around Jesus' head laying there, and separate from the linen. And finally the other disciple, the fast one, who reached the tomb first, goes inside, and they both look and they see and they believe, and then they leave. They go back. It says they go back from where they came. So Mary Magdalene is standing outside the tomb, and she's crying and she's weeping, and she bends over and she sees into the tomb too, but she doesn't see the white linen. What she sees are two angels, one at the top of where Jesus' head was and one at where his feet were. And they look at her and they say, "Woman, why are you crying? Why are you crying?" I think it's such a beautiful and compassionate moment. It reminds me when I was a kid, I was like 15, and my mom had just passed away, and my dad was struggling with being a single parent, and my sister came home from college, and she told us that she was pregnant. She was a freshman in college. She wasn't married, and I knew this was going to be the first time that my dad had to figure out how to be a parent on his own, and the whole house was kind of shaking with nervous energy. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I went up to my room and I started crying, because I could see my dad was struggling, and I could see my sister felt like she was shamed in some way. And I was in my bedroom weeping, and my sister Barbara came in with her boyfriend. We shared a bedroom, so she came into the bedroom, and she said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "I'm crying because we don't know what to do. Dad's upset, and Maggie's upset, and we don't know what to do." And my sister Barbara, without skipping a beat, she said to me the gospel of truth. She said, "This is the best day ever." And I was like, "What?" And her boyfriend was like, "Yeah, this is the best day ever." And I was like, "Really?" And I watched how these words transformed me from "this is terrible" to "this is awesome." And this is the gospel that was constantly shared in my home. Like, you think this is going to scare us? We're big, mighty people. We're so much better than this. And she was like, "Hey, this is going to be one of the best things that ever happens to her." And I had a transformation in my mind. So that's a gospel that's worth repeating. You got this. We got this. It's going to be okay. Not just okay. This is going to be the best day ever. Our nephew Christopher, he is an amazing individual now today. he is one of the best things that has happened to our family. So Mary's at the tomb, and she's standing there, and she's weeping, and the angels are talking to her, and she feels someone behind her, and she thinks it's a gardener, and she says, "Hey, do you know where they've taken my Lord so I can go and get him?" And the gardener says, "Mary." And she recognizes Jesus' voice, and she screams out, "Robini," which means teacher. And she goes to lean in to touch him, and he says, "Wait, I'm ascending. I'm going to my God, to your God. I'm going to my Father, to your Father. Go and tell the apostles that I'm rising." And so she does. He says, "This is not the death, this is the life of me. I'm rising." Mary goes and tells the other disciples, "I've seen the Lord. Christ is risen." So she's this passionate and powerful, fearless woman. She doesn't want to just stop with the apostles. She wants to take it all the way to the top of the ladder. She goes to the emperor. She wants her audience with the emperor. In order to get an audience with the emperor, you have to bring a gift. And she brings an egg. So she stands there with an egg, her gift to the emperor. Mary Magdalene, as we know, doesn't usually play a big part in this story of Easter, and she's usually sidelined and sequestered into the blanket statement of the women at the cross. We don't really go into the specifics of the women at the cross. She's just one of the women at the cross. It's funny because we did that to my two brothers when they were younger. They were the two boys. They lost their names, Jimmy and Andrew. They just became the two boys, So it's forgivable. But Mary Magdalene, she's the first one to see Christ. And it's important for us to remember that her gospel is not Robini has risen, it's not my Lord has risen, it's not Jesus has risen, it's not Jeshua has risen, but Christ has risen. Because Christ is synonymous with light, and synonymous with truth, and synonymous with unconditional love. And that's what lives within all of us. So when we see leaders who are moving from that Christ consciousness, we can say, Christ is risen here. This teacher, this leader, is helping us to see things in a brighter way. This teacher, this leader is unveiling for us some doubts, some confusion. They're bringing things up to light so that we can see things better. So Mahatma Gandhi, Christ has risen. He brought us to this really rough conversation and showed us how love would transform this. Martin Luther King, Christ has risen. He took us to this very rough conversation, and he demonstrated how love could move forward. Mother Teresa, she does the same thing. She takes us to very, very rough neighborhoods, and she demonstrates love. Christ is risen. That's the light. That's the potential that lives within all of us. Now, sometimes this light within us, we think, I know Mahatma Gandhi, I know Martin Luther. It can get kind of dim and dulled down. We can start to believe the limitations that the world places on us. We've all had our traumas and dramas and trials that we've had to move through, and some of those can kind of take the shine off of our brilliance. But still, love rises, and still we have the capacity of rising in love. Sometimes when we have our own personal resurrections, there's a part of us that has to be left behind. And sometimes it's ourself that prevents our own rising because we don't want to let go of our security blankets. But think of a rocket. When it rises, it drops the booster. When a flower rises, it drops the shell. These things aren't necessary, but they are necessary to release. And so for us, when we rise, we have to be comfortable with things not making it through the resurrection, to being left here. But those things that are being left, they're not necessary. So we don't have to fear. We don't have to fear the loss of anything. We don't have to fear the loss of the body. We don't have to fear the loss of things changing form. Things will change form, and still beneath the form is the content of love. So you can kill the man. You can burn the church. You can silence and slut shame the messenger. But love will rise. Can I get an amen? Yeah! The light has come, and Mary carries the good news, and she carries it to the apostles, and she goes on to the emperor, and she goes with her gift of the egg, and she delivers this good news. Christ is risen, and the emperor laughs at her and says, Jesus is no more risen, then your egg is turned to red. And in that moment, the egg turns red. Yeah, the egg turns red. So we have this red egg now, this symbol that she holds in her hand, and we see it in all these icons, these pictures of the Saint Mary Magdalene with this red egg. And if you ask me, it reminds me of fertility. It reminds me of the feminine cycle, the blood that gives life. So this is not socially acceptable to talk about the blood that gives life. No. We're immersed in a society, though, that's very comfortable with the blood that comes from death, right? So why is that? Why do we tolerate what is so unnatural and have great intolerance for what is completely natural? The feminine cycle, the cycle of our sexuality. It's happening all around us. Why has it been excluded and amputated from our churches and our spiritual conversations? I spoke with a woman the other day who told me that she was kicked out of church for breastfeeding her baby. And I said to her, good, this is the best day ever. You know, it was one of those churches that made you walk around and ring doorbells, if you know what I mean. Not to knock anybody's religion, but we gotta bring to light these ideas that fall under the umbrella of religion, like where we're excluding awesome people for asinine reasons. So it's just not okay. So the feminine body specifically is kept quiet in these conversations. Under certain religious definitions, we have, spiritual role models for women are the virgin or the whore. That's as good as it gets. And there's really no middle ground. And there is the adulteress, or the completely pure. And we never actually see the guy who's doing all the adulting. Where's he? Why isn't he on trial, as Joan Burns likes to say? So these are questions. We get to have these questions. But the thing there's a problem that we don't want to have these questions because we're holding on to the old past security blankets. We've been domesticated into thinking that talking about breastfeeding and talking about our cycles and talking about sexuality and the Red River, that these are things that make us not nice. And so it's a beautiful way to keep the silence secure. But as I get older, I get less nice. I shed some old stories and move closer to my own bone. Maybe you want to go there too. Like a rocket, like a flower, letting go of that which no longer serves me. I've been very tolerant. We've been very tolerant of the blood that brings death and our intolerance for this blood that brings life. And it seems like this war of acceptance has been going on for centuries. And it's possibly the time that we change the tide and that we become fearless around having these conversations. So let's shed a little bit more light on this idea. So we have this egg that Mary Magdalene is holding, and it's depicted of a symbol for her, right? And we have tons of symbols that we get to peek underneath. Jesus has many symbols as well, right? So there's a symbol of the fish. When we see a fish on the back of someone's car, we say that person believes in Jesus, right? So we have the fish, and we have the egg. And we have the egg and the fish. Where else do we see these symbols? Yeah, where else do we see these symbols? The fish and the egg. And sexuality. Yes. I had to say that. I was thinking you would get there on your own. So these are just conversations, just stirring up the pot, seeing what's there. Beginning in 1896, a fragmented manuscript known as the Gnostic Gospels was discovered by theologians, the Gospel of Mary. Believed to have been written in the 3rd century, reveals a Mary Magdalene who had a special relationship with Jesus and possessed a deeper understanding of his teachings, as she was considered an associate, a companion, and has been interpreted to mean that the relationship was intimate. That gives us something more to think about. Because we don't want to think about that. It's like thinking about a nun having sex. It's like Jesus didn't have sex, But he was a man. He lived in the world. He was of the world. Maybe it's time to question that perhaps that's where all the shame has come from, was the annihilation of this part of the story in all of our communal conversations. And maybe it's time to start to have that. The egg is also a symbol of new birth, of new concepts, of new ideas. And in this story, Mary is this worthy messenger who fearlessly and boldly presents herself to the law, to the emperor, stands in her unflinching truth and delivers the good news. And from this impeccable faith, miracles unfold. Can we do that? Can we be that brave? Can we look at the broken laws of man in the eye and say, love will have the final say? In A Course in Miracles, it tells us that a happy ending to all things are sure. So today on Easter, as the stone is rolled away and Jesus tells Mary, I'm not down, I'm on the rise. And she sees the light of life in the story of death. And she preaches this gospel of life. And as we witness the shedding of winter and the celebration of spring, it's easy for us not to get hung up on the illusion of death. But there are things that we do get hung up on. There are symbols and stories that we do get hung up on. So many questions, curiosities, images worthy of contemplation. Are you questioning? Are you standing in your truth? Are you following the river of life or death, of love or fear? And what is the truth that you're delivering? And are you willing to stand in the face of mockery and doubt? And what's the good news that you're carrying to others? And what are the blocks that you're letting go of so that you can rise? Easter is a time of great release. You should feel a release. You should ask for your release. Jesus releases his body. His spirit is released from the tomb. Flowers release from their bud. The frozen lakes release the water. There's releasing happening all around us. Grass is released to the barren fields, and everything comes out of hiding and hibernation. It's audacious. And when we speak of forgiveness, we're also speaking about release. We're releasing the other from blame or shame, and we get released as well. And in the releasing of the other, we get to be a more audacious version of ourselves. We get to spring into a more audacious version because we're not holding down the crucifixion. We get to let go of that. We get to let go of all the old stories and the old ideas, to just shed it all. Only thing left will be God. Because the only thing we don't need to let go of is God. Because God has us, God holds us, God knows us. Even if we did let go of God, God is so compassionate, has such a beautiful hold on us and such a long leash that we could fall and fly and falter and still land in the compassion and embrace of God. God is. We could cease to speak and say God is. That's what the Course in Miracles says. So it asks us to surrender everything. Are you that intimate with your God? Are you that faithful with your God? Are you that fearless with your God? Are you that able to fall into that God and know that everything else will be given to you as you let go of the symbols and the stories and the form? So God is synonymous mostly with our breath. And if we want to get back to our God, we're given this idea of breath. And even in the breath, there's a release. There's an inhale, and then there's an exhale. Everywhere it's teaching us about letting go. Letting go and letting go and letting go and getting into the flow. So the prayer for Easter is, God, lead us to you through our breath. When our days are done, take even that from us. Release us from the illusion of separation so that we can know only you. Rumi says it this way, O beloved, take me. Liberate my soul. Fill me with your love. Release me from the two worlds. If I set my heart on anything, let fire burn me from inside. Oh, beloved, take away what I want. Oh, beloved, take away what I do. Oh, beloved, take away what I need. Oh, beloved, take everything that takes me from you. That's a passionate prayer, and that's the word.